Last night, Eric and I attempted to return to an abandoned house we have explored twice in the past. The thing about this house is that you have to hike to get to it from where we have to park. To get to the house, we would have to walk across a field surrounded by a forest, cross a small stream or runoff, then walk along an abandoned railroad track to cross a creek into the woods. Once out of the wooded area, we would have to walk across another field to finally reach the house. We left our vehicle parked as close as possible to the location. It was about 11 o'clock at night and should have only been about a 20 or 30 minute walk to the house. We both were a little nervous because the night before we attempted to go explore there, but when we got to the field and looked towards the wooded area, there were flashlights shining everywhere and a lot of dogs barking. It sounded like the police had their dogs out searching for someone. At that point, we both decided it would be best if we just went home and try again the next night if we didn't find out what all the commotion was. Well, needless to say, we couldn't find any information of what might have been happening, so around 11 o'clock the next night, we decided to go back. We gathered our supplies, made sure the cameras were charged, the flashlights were working, and headed to the field. It was a dark night, darker than the night before. We couldn't even see halfway across the field like we could the night before. The only light came from the stars. The moon wasn't even out yet. The air was deadly calm with a heavy feeling, not a single breeze to be felt. The only sounds tonight were the big bullfrogs in the pond in the middle of that first field. We stood at the edge of the field for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality it was only maybe 5 minutes. We stood there just listening, trying to adjust our eyes. "I can't seem to get my eyes to adjust to this darkness tonight," I whispered. "I keep seeing darker spots, if that's even possible in this darkness." "Me either," Eric whispered. "You know, I never have a problem seeing in the dark, but for some reason tonight I can't." After a few more minutes in complete silence, we slowly and cautiously started to walk along the wooded edge of the field. The walk to the first stream seemed to drag on, but with each step we took, our eyes were adjusting. When we arrived to the runoff, we walked up to the narrowest part and stepped across. We then moved back along the tree line and continued on our way. It was still extremely dark out, but our eyes were finally starting to adjust, and I started to feel a little more comfortable, at least enough to keep moving. I kept walking forward with Eric beside me, slowly, one step at a time, eyes forward, half scared to look in the tree line. Scared something would jump out at any minute. I think he was starting to feel a little better about being there too, because he was walking a little faster now. Suddenly, when we were almost to the corner of the field where we had to move into the wooded area to the train tracks to cross the creek, birds started squeaking and fluttering wildly. It was like something ahead had spooked him. I jumped and Eric froze and looked around. He turned to me and chuckled at me for my reaction. He started walking again, moving closer to the path that led to the tracks. Up to here, the field grass was cut back for the most part, but now the grass was getting taller and taller. By the time we got to the corner of the field, the grass was up to my shoulders. I'm about 5'5", so that was some pretty tall grass. The tallest I've ever walked through. The dew had started to set in, and by now we were both getting damp. We stopped at the path's entrance and again just stood there looking and listening. It was still really quiet. Even the bullfrogs from earlier had stopped their call. Satisfied that nothing was around, we moved up the path to the train tracks. We were both standing on the tracks and started walking in a single file to the opening. Suddenly, Eric just stopped dead in his tracks. At this point, we still hadn't turned on our flashlights so our eyes wouldn't have to readjust. I whispered to Eric, "What's the matter?" Eric holds his hand up in a gesture for me to hold on a minute. He turned on his flashlight and shines it in front of him on the ground. Not even 2 steps in front of him is a large pine tree laying on its side across the tracks. At first glance, it looked like maybe it fell in the storm. While investigating for a way around the tree, Eric notices that it had been cut down deliberately and placed on the tracks. He moves towards the end of the trunk and points his flashlight ahead, looking to see if there was an easy enough path around. All of a sudden, Eric turns to me and loudly whispers, "Go! Get out of here!" I turn and as quickly as possible make my way back down the overgrown path to the tracks and into the field. Once safely back in the field in the really tall grass, Eric says, "Go as fast as you can back to the vehicle." I started jogging back down the field through the tall grass, trying not to trip. Eric is right beside me. Once out of the tall grass, he stops and turns, flashlight in one hand, his knife in the other. He looks behind us for a minute, then continues moving as quickly as possible beside me back down the field. We didn't slow down till we got to the small runoff. After we crossed, we stopped by the tree line to catch our breath. When I could breathe easily again, I looked up to Eric and asked, "What happened? What did you see?" Eric took a good look around us, then turned to me and said, "Someone was hiding up there. I caught sight of a man in dark pants and a camo hoodie standing by the tree. I almost didn't see him, but he moved when my flashlight pointed at him. When he realized I saw him, he started to follow us until we got back to the field." Maybe that's who they were looking for last night. It is kind of weird, some random person hiding in the woods at this time of night. I'll have to check again tomorrow to see about what might have gone on here, I said. A few minutes later, we were back at the vehicle. As we unlocked the doors, I noticed that not only was it getting brighter outside, all of the normal noises of the night had returned. It was no longer deadly silent and pitch black. I felt safe again, almost relieved. The next day in the local news, we saw that indeed the police were out searching for a man in that area. He was a suspect in an armed robbery and believed to be armed and dangerous. The description of the suspect's clothing was exactly what Eric saw in the man in the woods.